All right. I want to welcome everybody to the Queens Historical Society's newest digital visit program on the religious tolerance in Queens. So I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with Queens history with the Flushing Remonstrance and its importance to the ideals of religious freedom in the early United States colonies. But the importance of what was going on in the colonies is actually far more complex. And there's also other things happening in other colonies at the same time that I want to explore in today's program. So, as I had just mentioned, during the colonial period in 1657, a petition was penned in response to the persecution and torture of a Robert Hodgson, the Quaker. And it was basically a show of force by Peter Stuyvesant, the Director General here at the time, to show how much he disliked the Quakers. So Peter Stuyvesant was the Director General of the New Netherlands colony. He was appointed by the Dutch East India Company. And we'll get a little bit more into that. But Stuyvesant was particularly notable for his extreme disdain of other religious practices other than his own. For context, he was a Dutch Reformed Church adherent. So any person trying to practice their religion outside of his own, he would show extreme prejudice towards. Stuyvesant would prevent and block Lutherans, Jews, Catholics, and Quakers, among others, from settling in his colony. But early colonial period religious practices were not uniform at all. Even in the beginning, people had different motivations for coming to the colonies in the first place. The first permanent English settlement in the Americas was Jamestown in 1608. Jamestown is in Virginia. And this colony was founded by Anglican members of the Church of England. The other well-known group, the Pilgrims, are actually dissenters from the Church of England, and they established the Puritans. So these two groups, Jamestown and Plymouth in Massachusetts, could sometimes be at odds with each other over religious disagreements because they were two different groups. The Puritans of the Plymouth had actually tried distancing themselves earlier from the Church of England and had moved themselves to Holland at the time, and as an attempt to try and find some place where they could more strictly adhere to their religious practices. But they found that even Holland was not happy for them because they weren't able to really create an environment where they could be as strict as they wanted with religious adherence. They found that Holland was a little bit too liberal for them. So having heard about the opportunity in the Americas to establish new colonies, they decided to take up that offer after they had heard about the Jamestown colony. They received a land patent from the London Company, which operated the English colonies at the time, and with the understanding from the governor that the Puritan religion and lifestyle would not be officially recognized in the colony, they were granted that permission to settle in America. they were excited to be able to solidify their own lifestyle with this opportunity, and they had intended to actually settle in the Hudson River, not too far from New York. However, on their way over, due to bad storms, they were blown off course and they didn't have enough supplies to really relocate. So they ended up settling in Plymouth, in Cape Cod. So the London Company, here we go. We have two different companies that are kind of going on at once, but the London Company, which operates the red section at first, they reorganized and got new permissions from the land grants, usually royalty, to extend their reach. And so in 1609, the charter was actually expanded to be sea to sea, which meant that it went from the East Coast to wherever, because at the time they hadn't discovered the edge of the Pacific Ocean. And so the idea was that the colony would continue to expand westward eventually. However, the London Company actually starts to develop growing debt and eventually collapses. This leads to the Crown, the King of England, taking over control of the colonies, and he starts to rule them directly rather than through a company of investors. And so the Crown appoints a governor. Originally, the land chartered by Virginia is divided up, and the new charters are created. Maryland is its own charter. We'll get to Maryland's importance in all this in just a second. But the Plymouth colony becomes New England. And so the charters get divided up and new rule is established. So Maryland is another important charter because it was created by George Calvert and his son Cecil Calvert. So George Calvert never lived long enough to really see Maryland, but Cecil Calvert was, his son was able to go there and became essentially the governor of Maryland. And the important thing about the charter is that it was created as a Catholic colony in the Americas. So it was the first Catholic colony to be established in the Americas because of the London Company typically being under the umbrella of the Church of England, which is a Protestant church. So after the English Civil War and things start transferring hands, the Hudson area is under the rule of Amsterdam and the Dutch. So in 1624, the Dutch West India Company, another investment firm rather than a crown holding, sponsored 30 families to settle in Manhattan, and they created New Amsterdam in 1626. This was mostly a colony to establish fur trade. So after slow expansion and some conflict, the board of directors at the Dutch West India Company decided that they wanted somebody in charge who would more rapidly expand this colony, because it's very important in a colony to have people. And so they appointed Peter Stuyvesant in 1647. Now, let's scroll back. Stuyvesant is well known for his very controlling nature, and he liked to kind of micromanage. And compared to the previous director general, who was kind of hands-off, Peter Stuyvesant was very prescriptivist. He wanted to directly control a lot of the aspects of the colony, and so he would pass edicts and laws. And this tendency to do that would frequently land him in hot water with his bosses, the board of directors. So, there we go. In 1657, Stuyvesant had prevented some Lutherans from founding a church in New Amsterdam. This was met by resistance by the board of directors, who had forced him to rescind this order blocking the Lutherans. And so actually a few years prior, in 1654, two Jewish traders had settled in New Amsterdam, and they were later joined by refugees from Brazil, because Brazilian colonies had already been established, and it was very common due to the Atlantic slave trade for there to be a route from Africa to South America in the Indies or the Caribbean islands. Then the ships would head back up north to past Florida and up through the English colonies, and then back over to Europe because of the way the currents worked. So some Jewish refugees from Brazil tried settling in New Amsterdam. However, Stuyvesant was highly against the presence of Jews in his colony, and he sought to expel them. However, again, the board of directors felt that this was unfair and forced him to let them stay. So one of the reasons why people are being let to stay in these colonies is because when you're trying to establish a colony, you need people. And the more people you have, the more powerful that the colony is, and the more likely it is to continue to survive, because then you have more people doing more work. So there is a certain benefit to there being a little bit of religious tolerance from the board of directors perspective, because then it means more people can be in the colony, and thus its financial value as a colony is more secure. So Stuyvesant would continue these moments of prejudice. In 1656, a cobbler from Rhode Island came to Flushing, and he began to baptize people in the East River. And Stuyvesant thought, oh, this guy's a Baptist. He's got to go. So he threw him out of the colony because he wasn't practicing the Dutch Reformed. In 1657, the first Quakers came to New Amsterdam by boat. The Quakers are quite famous in Flushing, and we'll get to why in a bit. But due to the Quakers' customs, such as not taking off one's hat, and their method of preaching also involved loud and bombastic sermons, and thus where they got their name Quakers, because they would shake with passion. This would later change as they adopted new practices, but at the time they were known for being very bombastic about that. And Stuyvesant was absolutely offended by their presence, and the Quakers who had arrived by boat were promptly sent away after they had arrived. But then when another Quaker, Robert Hodgson, the one I mentioned earlier, he began preaching in New Amsterdam and was quickly arrested. Stuyvesant had him bound and dragged by a cart and then thrown in a dungeon. He then was tried and convicted without any of the ability to defend himself, and was sentenced to manual labor. Upon refusing the sentence, he was whipped to near death and then sent to Rhode Island. So he was absolutely set on torturing people who basically disobeyed his desires for a singular belief system. So Stuyvesant was now very annoyed with the Quakers and their flamboyance, and so he actually passed a law that would give anyone caught harboring or giving passage to a Quaker a stiff fine. This prompted a petition written by the people of Flushing, known as the Flushing Remonstrance. So this letter was actually more to remind Stuyvesant that the law of love and peace and liberty extended to all. Oops, oh no. I went too far and it broke my slides. Sorry, one moment. Okay. So this is the actual Flushing Remonstrance. You'll notice it's a little crispy at the top. It was damaged in a fire of the archives a long time ago. I don't remember the exact date, but most of it survives. And we do have copies and translations, thankfully. But this is the document that was presented to Stuyvesant. And you can notice on the third page, it's a list of names of the people who signed it. So this letter would go on to say that the law of love, peace, and liberty extended to all. And it included and specifically says Jews, Turks, and Egyptians. So it does intend to say, hey, religious tolerance should be in our colony, and that it should apply to everybody. Stuyvesant predictably responded to this by arresting 4 of the signers and asked them to recant their support. 2 of them would do so immediately, but the other 2 took a little pressure before they eventually did. So in response to this insult, Stuyvesant declared in 1856 that March 13th was to be a day of prayer, to repent for the sin of religious tolerance. So this Stuyvesant is very fanatic about saying, no, it has to be done this way. But of course, this is not the end of Quaker activity in Flushing. Stuyvesant would eventually learn that the Quakers were still holding meetings in the house of John Bowne, which, if you're familiar with the Queen's Historical Society, we're located in Flushing. It's right across the street. The Bowne House is still around, and highly recommend visiting it. But because of John Bowne allowing Quakers to harbor and hold meetings in his house, they arrested him in 1662. He was assessed a fine, as per the law had warned, and he refused to pay this. And as such, he was sent to face trial in front of the Dutch West India Company in Holland. There, he argued his case that the governor's patent in the colony did call for religious liberty. And eventually, the board of directors do decide in Bowne's favor, stating that trying to force colonists' consciousnesses, which is to say their ability to reconcile religious doctrine in their own way, would actually, if they were trying to force the colonists, it would discourage immigration. And so in 1663, Stuyvesant was told explicitly to allow all sects of religion in the colony. So this case would actually be among the first in the colonies that dictated religious freedom. However, it's not the first. Other examples are in 1635 with the founding of Rhode Island as a colony without an explicit state-appointed religion, because typically at the time, part of the charters did involve a specific religion. And Maryland, a Catholic colony, had an act passed in 1649 dictating that the freedom of worship for Christians would be allowed. However, this meant that non-Christians would still be put to death. So, despite the fact that any sect of Christianity, from Protestant to Catholic, were allowed in Maryland, you still couldn't practice Judaism or be a Muslim or even an atheist. This law in Maryland would actually be repealed in 1664, making Catholicism the only allowed religion again. So they actually lost some religious freedom. So Queens today is an incredibly diverse area, and it's full of many different religious practices, and this didn't happen all at once. So I'm going to go over a few examples of different religions and when they started being able to really express themselves in Queens, and also when they first were able to establish themselves amongst the other religions within Queens. So obviously, Protestant Christianity was the prominent religion to take hold in the colonies, and there's clear favor towards it in many of the laws. Concepts of Christian identity were very important for the European powers to claim legitimacy in their overseas colonies. However, there are many different branches of Christian ideology that would very reluctantly, very regularly butt heads, as I alluded to with Peter Stuyvesant's distaste for everything non-Dutch Reformed. However, I'm not going to be able to really go over every single branch of Christianity and how they flourished in the new colonies, just because there's a lot of them, and there's a lot more to focus on as well. Oh, and I should add for context, for the aspect that European colonists used religion as a way of adding legitimacy to their colonization. This has a long history, and one of the best examples of that is the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1493, which is when the Pope divided the New World into two halves between Portugal and Spain. And Portugal was given the eastern side of the New World from essentially Brazil and eastward. And this would also include some colonies in the Indian Ocean. And then Spain would get the colonies to the west. That's why Brazil speaks Portuguese, and the rest of Latin America, most of Latin America, speaks Spanish. It's because of the Treaty of Tordesillas. The religious ideology behind this decision is that the Christians were obligated to spread Christianity in the New World and convert the native population, and in the process they would be making money, but it was justified through religion. So I'm going to start with Catholics in the colonies. They were frequently discriminated against by the prominently Protestant groups in the colonies who had immigrated here from the Protestant nations. However, all of this discrimination discouraged Roman Catholics from coming to the Americas in any large numbers. or if they did, they weren't very outward with their faith. They would have to practice their faith in private. It wasn't until 1655 that the first Mass was given in a chapel in upstate New York by Jesuit missionaries. And even then, it wasn't until 1683 that the first Mass was given in Manhattan. But that was because there was a Catholic governor of New York at the time. His name was Thomas Dongan. But as this English Civil War and then the Revolutionary War shook things up, Catholicism was decidedly unpopular in the new colonies. And so the anti-Catholic sentiment was very common during the Revolutionary War, especially because the idea of a pope being in charge of Catholics was seen as counter to the anti-royalist ideals that the budding country was trying to cultivate. So it actually wasn't until 1785 that a permanent structure was built as a chapel in New York. In Queens, there weren't Catholic churches until the mid-1800s. Due to an increase of immigrant populations and the need for churches closer to the parishioners. The first Catholic church would have been set up in Manhattan, where population centers were, and since Queens was mostly farmland at the time, there wasn't much need for anything closer until the immigration boom, and then they would build Catholic churches. Another very important group to fight for their own religious freedom in Queens was the African Methodist Episcopal churches. Their story really starts in 1787 in Pennsylvania with the Free African Society. This was a group that was created in response to how the Black community was treated as second class by the Methodist Church. And so the growing Black congregation had actually been asked to separate themselves from the white congregation because of a lack of space. And so the Free African Society was founded to allow them a little bit more control and actualization of their religious experience. And so it was founded so that they would have a church of their own that would meet their community's needs, because their needs were different. So the Free African Society would actually eventually incorporate into the African Methodist Episcopal Church and would spread all around the country. Here in Queens, the Macedonian African Methodist Episcopal Church was established in 1811. This was the third church to be founded here in Flushing. And in 1816, the Free African Society would really achieve full autonomy and incorporate as the AME Church. And so what had actually happened with the Macedonian Church is that the Free African Society / AME had sent a reverend up to found the church here in Flushing shortly before things were made super official. But in 1902, another church in Newtown at the time, nowadays it's Corona, would also be founded as St. Mark's African Methodist Episcopal Church. St. Mark's had actually been a congregation that had been founded by 4 freed Blacks who had purchased their some land to establish a church for their families. After the church had kind of fallen out of use and into obscurity, there was a legal battle over the land because it wasn't clear as to who owned it. Eventually, a Black congregation hired a lawyer to establish the lineage and the ownership rights of the previous 4 former slaves. and were able to reincorporate it as a church. And then they gave it the name St. Mark's AME Church. Both the Macedonian AME Church and St. Mark's AME are still active today. The congregations are still around. However, they're both in new locations. So next up would be the Jewish faith. In Queens, the congregation, and I am sorry if I butchered this name, I'm going to type it into chat so that way you guys can see it. Where'd it go? There it is. So, the Tiffareth Israel was a congregation that was founded in 1897, and the building was started in 1907. It's the oldest existent synagogue in Queens, but in Manhattan, in New York City in general, the Tiffareth Israel was the only Jewish congregation in New York City for a remarkably long time. It was from 1654 to 1825 that it serviced all of the Jews in New York City. By the time that the Tiffareth Israel was founded, it was to accommodate the growing Jewish population here in Queens. Similarly, mosques are relatively new in New York City. Muslims were definitely a part of the founding of the nation because enslaved people were definitely here in New York City, and as potentially as many as 30% of enslaved Africans were of the Muslim faith. And they were forced to convert to Christianity. However, we can assume that not everybody is actually converting. They're merely pretending to do so under threat of violence. So the Muslims were able to practice the religion where they were and did not require a building. However, the first building that would be expressly built and used as a mosque was actually built in Brooklyn in 1907 at the Power Street Mosque. And today we continue to have mosques built as the Muslim population continues to grow here in Queens. Another group that is here in Flushing is the Hindu temple. The Hindu religion, however, the first public demonstration of the Hindu religious practices in the United States was actually in 1893, in the late 19th century. And this was in Chicago during an event called the Parliament of the World's Religions. Unfortunately, due to Western bias, Hinduism was actually seen as a cult. And so the worshippers were actually relegated to practicing in their own homes privately for a very long time. It wasn't until the late 20th century, in 1970, that the first Hindu temple was established in the United States, here in Flushing. The Hindu Temple Society was formed, and initially it was relegated to a living room of the members, but by 1977, the first temple is actually being constructed and is still open today. So another group that I think definitely needs a lot of spotlight is the Native American religious practices. And it wasn't actually until 1978 that the federal government actually started to recognize the freedom of religion for Native Americans. They had been frequently denied the same First Amendment laws that other groups had enjoyed. And so with the passing of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, it was the first instance of allowing Native Americans freedom to practice their own religions. However, this law was heavily criticized for actually not being strong enough. And this strength was tested in the Supreme Court and was found to be insufficient to have any actual power. And so it wasn't until 1994 that the law was amended to increase its power and strengthen it. So this is within even my own lifetime that people are finally starting to receive the same religious freedom. However, it should be noted that, or at least acknowledged, that the act in both 1978 and 1994 both acknowledged the prior denial of religious freedom that the United States policies had on Native Americans. The denial of the freedom of religion included things like forced relocation and integration of tribal groups into places far away from their homes. It should be noted that due to a strong connection between place and spiritual meaning, this would deny communities their ability to access, it would deny these communities access to their religious rights. Other instances of denial is regards to objects and interred bodies. But there were laws that were regarding objects that interfered, such as the inability to collect eagle feathers for religious rites. That was another instance of interfering with Native American religious practices. Also, things like the use of peyote were regulated and blocked by the government. And even then, even after the laws were passed, there's still just a general denial that Native Americans' religions were even qualified as religions. And so it meant that law enforcement and politicians would sometimes interfere with the religious practices. I should also mention in 1990, the passage of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which allowed tribal societies to repatriate both objects and the deceased back into their communities after they had been taken through archaeological programs or general theft or other destruction. This allowed the Native American groups to repatriate bodies and reinter them, which is important for their religious practices, but it was able to happen because of the difference between Native American practices and Christian practices. The law had previously only protected marked graves, so you had to have like a headstone in order to have a protected grave. However, Native Americans didn't always use marked graves, and so this would end up with disturbed deceased bodies. So to kind of wrap it up a little bit, it's still kind of obvious that religious freedom is still a present topic in today's society, and even in the 21st century, we still have issues with religious freedom and being encroached upon, such as in 8 states, it's still illegal to be an atheist and have public office. It should be noted that those laws are unenforceable due to a Supreme Court ruling and the First Amendment, but the laws still exist on the books. And so our society still has to continue to unpack its biases that it has grown up with from its colonial era and apply these religious freedoms to everyone that has been left out. And it's important to recognize those biases and work to correct them in meaningful ways. So I believe that's the end of everything that I have to say. So I want to thank everybody for joining me. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask, and I'll do my best to answer them. But if you want to type it into chat or unmute yourselves to ask, I believe you guys should be allowed. Whoops. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me slide. Let me make sure that it's share screen. Okay, sorry about that. This is a picture of the Flushing Friends Meeting House. This is the one of the oldest buildings of worship in the United States. It's been continuously in use since 1694. And this was built shortly after Bound won his case in Amsterdam and came back, and they founded the building to openly practice their Quakerism. That's all I've really got in terms of pictures. Ooh, I see another chat message. It's not showing up. Hold on. Adrian asked the question, was the religious intolerance of the Quakers of the early Flushing Dutch colony from the Dutch themselves, or was it the bias of Peter Stuyvesant? If it was the Dutch, why? I'm not 100% sure if the other Dutch colonists participated in the bias. I don't have as much literature on the Dutch colonists themselves. Most of my literature focused on Peter Stuyvesant, who was definitely a source of the religious intolerance that the Quakers faced. So unfortunately, I can't answer that in super detail, but I would imagine that there was at least a passing amount of tolerance because I didn't read any instances of them being forcibly ousted by anybody other than Peter Stuyvesant, but I don't have any literature to back that up. So I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of their day to come to the Queens Historical Society's digital visits. We actually have a couple of other programs coming up. On October 4th, we have a virtual tour of Elmhurst. So if you want to get out of the house and see Elmhurst through the eyes of our tour guide, Adrienne Onofri, then please join us for that. We'll be broadcasting that from the streets, and I think that will be through YouTube. We also have on October 11th our Hispanic Heritage Month activity, where we'll have a live cooking demonstration on making pan de muerto, which is an orange bread that is connected with Dia de los Muertos, and we'll have someone explain its significance and how to make it. It's actually quite delicious. And then coming up on October 25th, we also have the Queens Historical Society's fundraiser. So that should be a big production and super fun. We'll be doing the Italian American heritage and history, and we'll also be doing an art sale as a fundraiser. So I hope you guys can join us for that. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thank you for coming.